People are still joining us and taking their seats here, but I think we're right at the time mark, so I'd like to get started. My name is Clay Chandler. I have been invited by Terry to step in and substitute on short notice here for Sheila Smith, who was not able to join us at the last minute for family reasons, unfortunately. But I'm honored to be able to lead this distinguished panel about a country that is so vital to the future of Asia, and I think gets less attention lately than it deserves, and that is Japan. We're going to talk about change in Japan. I've certainly seen a lot of that over the course of my career. I started out as a Japan hand, as a student of Ezra Vogel in the 80s when Japan was, everyone assumed, soon to take over the world, and all the best and brightest from American universities believed that the best thing for their careers was to march off to Tokyo, which I promptly did, and found it to be a fascinating and absorbing place. I started at the Wall Street Journal in 1989 as a correspondent there, taking a break from my PhD studies, thinking that I would only do it for a little while to see how it goes, just because a lot was going on in finance and the economy in Japan at the time. I joined the Journal at the week that the Nikkei hit its peak, 36-something thousand, I remember. And I had a terrible influence on the Japanese stock market. After I joined the Journal, it proceeded to slide for the next 3 years. It was a great news story. Following it enabled me to learn a lot about Japan. But it was a seminal event, the collapse of that bubble, which we didn't really see coming until we were well into it. And in many ways, Japan has not recovered from that collapse since. We're going to talk today about some of the ways in which Japan is coming to terms with the legacy of that implosion and what it has fixed and what still needs further fixing. We were chatting a little bit about this over drinks last night, some of us, and I was reminded that when I later moved to the Washington Post, I had been away from Japan for a little while, and I was asked to go back and do a story about what was happening with the Japanese economy and what had changed. And I was sort of comparing it to the difference of going to places like Shanghai and Beijing, where if you're away for 2 or 3 months, as Richard will know, whole neighborhoods are transformed overnight. You can't find restaurants. The dry cleaner that used to be there is no longer there. In Japan, I was struck by just the opposite sensation, that how much was constant and how much was the same in Japan. There's a story that all Japanese school children learn about Urashima Taro, the guy who encounters this kind of mermaid-like creature who takes him under the sea. I guess it's a turtle or something, right? And takes him under the sea to her magic kingdom. He meets her family, is charmed, has a wonderful time, thinks he's only gone for a few hours, and then says, I have to get back to my mother and father on my village by the shore. She returns him to the shore, and he discovers that he's actually been away for 100 years and doesn't recognize anything about his village. Everyone has either, has died and long since gone, and it's this very tragic tale of how much things change when you're away. The story that I wrote for the Washington Post actually began by saying, actually, Japan is kind of the reverse of the Urashima Taro tale. So much seems to still be constant in Japan. So we'll talk about that, and we have a really distinguished and diverse panel to address 3 different aspects of that panel. We're going to start, I think, with some questions for Yamasaki-san, the former Vice Finance Minister for Japan, now an advisor to Mitsubishi Corporation. Talk a little bit about what's happening in the Japanese economy. We'll turn next for some expertise on the Japanese political and policy scene from Watanabe-san, who is with the Tokyo Foundation, an independent think tank. And then finally, we'll turn to Richard McGregor for a little bit of international context and how Japan's current status fits into the larger puzzle of Asia as a whole. And then as soon as we can, we'll try to get to your questions. So keep your questions in mind. We'll come to you as quickly as we can. Yamazaki-san, let's start out with you and Abenomics. We've been 2 years into, 3 years, almost 4, I guess now, into Abenomics. The thing I have always kind of thought about Abenomics is that it was this collection of twos. It was supposed to be 2 years to get to 2% inflation, 2% growth, and it was a doubling of the monetary supply. we haven't done very well on those indicators. I wonder if you could give us a scorecard on Abenomics, what's worked and what hasn't.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I stepped down as Vice Finance Minister last year, and I, accompanied almost all of Prime Minister Ms. Abe's foreign trips, including the G20 summit or G7 summit or his meeting with Xi Jinping, Putin, or Obama, or New York Stock Exchange, whatever. But the main questions I received there is exactly the same. Scorecard, and especially they are saying that yes, the first arrow, monetary policy, very aggressive, visible, but structural reform, invisible. But my answer is, are you really trying to watch the achievement of structural reform? Yeah, because we have a lot of structural reform already completed. Say the typical one is agricultural reform. Yeah, amended all relevant laws. And now that the private companies can join agricultural business, and also they can collect a small segmented fund loan into very big one. And not only this, but also the electricity retail sale reforms, medical care reforms. So I think that in terms of the development of the reform itself, it's almost, I can give 80 points out of 100. But its reflection on real growth rate says that the latest growth rate, the second quarter of this year is annualized basis just 0.7%. While given that Japanese potential growth rate is just 0.12%. And if it is adjusted because of the first quarter of this year, leap year, so maybe average current growth rate is 1.2, which means overperforming from the potential growth rate by almost 100 basis points, which is, I think, that among developed economies, Japan is best performing countries. However, the big problem is very weak consumption. That's why we postponed the consumption tax hike. The reason is that because of this absolutely low growth rate, people are not convicted that our wage continue to grow in long run, or our long-term pension system or our medical care system, long-term care system are really sustainable. So that's why we rather spare than spend.
So people are sort of sentiment is depressed. I mean, this check me if I'm wrong about this, but I looked at the consumer figures the other day. Consumer spending dropped. It's been 7 straight months. It dropped again in July. So you're saying that Abenomics structural reform doesn't get enough credit for what has been achieved, and yet there is this issue of the underlying potential of the economy that people really need to be using as the right basemark. I mean, does that suggest that the original 2% target was kind of overly ambitious given the limited growth potential of the underlying economy? Because I mean, he put that target out there and asked to be evaluated by it.
Yeah, there are 2% target.
Yeah.
Inflation and real growth rate. As well as inflation, it has already reached 1.5% mid of 2014. But immediately after that, it slowed down because of the oil price, yen's appreciation, and also the prolonged consumption tax hike negative effect on the economy. So I think maybe 2% of inflation target can be achievable given the external circumstances improve. And
so the domestic factors, you think that's happening, that's in place, that's going in the right direction. What we really need now is for the external context to be right.
Yeah, but of course that domestic factor, especially to narrow the deflation gap, is of course important. And that is related to the second objective of real growth rate to 2%. Of course, from the beginning, this is excessively ambitious target. But anyway, as I mentioned, now the target of the second round of Abenomics is to increase this potential growth from 0.2 to not necessarily 2%, but at least 1 or above.
And how can that happen? What has to happen for the underlying potential growth rate to shift into a higher
Yeah, you know
level?
that the component of the potential growth rate is labor input,
Yeah,
capital input,
right, of course.
and the total factor
Right.
productivity.
Right,
And the labor input
Yeah.
currently -1.
right,
So we need to shift up to 0 or even above.
right.
Of course, so we set the 2 long-term targets.
Yeah,
Declining population
Right.
should be stopped at 10 million
right.
in 50 years time.
So population, I can't remember what the year was, but it peaked about, what, 5, 6, 7 years ago? Something like that, 132, 133 million. It's now down to 126. Japan is losing something like 1 million people a year, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Uh,
So if we leave it, maybe in 100 years, the Japanese population will be below 50 million.
Wow. Well, but even, I mean, if you do the extrapolation, even as close as like 2050, 2045, something like that, it gets to a smaller population than it was before the Pacific War, right? I mean, that's an amazing kind of boom and bust. Does Japan have a way to reverse that cycle?
Yeah. So
How do you get people that, I mean, is it more children? Is it immigration? What's Japan's solution?
The lowest was 3 years ago, it was below 1.2.
Yeah.
And now gradually picking up to 1.4.
The birth rate.
To keep, yeah, birth rate, to
Yeah.
keep this, 100 million people in 50 years,
Yeah.
we need to pick up immediately to 1.8. 1.8.
Yeah. Is that possible?
Possible.
So check me if I'm wrong on this, because I've looked at the Scandinavian countries, France, lots of countries grappling with this problem of aging societies, low fertility rates. They've done all kinds of things, tax schemes, paternal leave, very progressive kind of things that are a far cry from even what Japan is contemplating. So far, to my knowledge, no country that has entered into this kind of negative spiral of low fertility rates has figured out a way that government policy can re-engineer it and send it in the other direction.
Yeah,
is Japan going to beat this record, a historic first, that it'll figure
There
it
are
out?
very, very wide range of the policies.
Yeah.
So very medical part
Right.
is that those who are now receiving the fertility treatment.
Yeah.
Now Japanese government has decided to support full amount of the treatment fees.
For fertility treatments. Huh.
But of course that is
Lots of triplets.
so more
policy.
fundamental one is that
Yeah.
the reason why is especially young couples are reluctant to have 2 and more babies.
Yeah.
Is that because they want to work even
Yeah.
after giving birth.
Right.
But currently it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And even now, there are so many people who want to work more, but who cannot.
Yeah.
So because of the shortage of the child care systems. So that's why now that a lot of budget is now allocated this year to
yeah.
this.
Oh.
And also, even if the birth rate shifted to 1.8, it
Yeah.
takes more than 20 years. Actual working age population increase.
To see the
So
result.
that's what we need now.
Right.
So that's why I say, like me,
Right.
like 60, around 60,
Uh-huh.
who are the retirement age, but who are still in good health,
Yeah.
want to work more.
Right.
But because of taking care our parents,
Uh-huh.
80s, 90s, so Japanese long-term care system is again very much poor.
Yeah.
So that's why we are now strengthening this, so that like me, our generation can still work outside.
Huh.
And also Japanese housewives,
Need to.
who
Yeah.
children already graduating school, who have enough time, but they don't want to work out. Why? Because of the Japanese current tax rebate for working wives is special.
Ah.
So there's no strong motivation to work outside.
Right.
So that's why we are rather, reforming this tax rebate, encourage them to work.
Yeah. I think we can talk a lot more about some of these issues later. I want to turn next, though, to Watanabe-san, shift from discussing Abenomics to discussing Abe himself. Abe's looking very strong right now. He's just come off this election in July. Landslide victory, swept control, 2/3 of the lower house, finally wrested control back of the upper house. Looks like he can do almost whatever he wants now. And how long can he remain as prime minister? How long can we expect Abe to continue to be the leader of Japan?
It's a just very good question. I think the timing we can think of the period of Abe is next Olympic. That's 4 years. Year 2020, and that's Tokyo Olympic. And you may see
that's a good long run.
The Abe acted Super Mario in
Yes.
in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
The many people say that that was a manifestation of the Abe could be the prime minister in 2020, and well, of course that's no guarantee, and probably Abe cannot think of now because all politicians really try to survive now, and not so long-term policy, and it really depends on. What I'd like to say is stability of Abe administration is coming from Japan's past really bad politics. I think Japan consumed 6 prime ministers in 6 years.
Yeah.
And starting Abe, by the way. Abe just started the first one in 1 year and forced to resign. So people realize, okay, weaker and the shorter government is really bad for the Japanese economy. And Abenomics somehow showed some good result. Not only good result, but a clearly good result. And foreign security policy, especially foreign policies, are good because Abe stay in a longer, stable one. And because of stable domestic politics, Abe can leave country. That means Diet do not keep a prime minister in a domestic mess. So Abe traveled all over the world, especially the impressive one is Abe visited the all member country of ASEAN and created a very good the connection with this. And also initiated the proactive contribution to peace. That's his slogan. That Japan do more non-combatant activity, but clearly try to stabilize the regional security. For example, providing Coast Guard ship to the several Southeast Asian country, and of course that makes a little bit nervous to the Chinese. But that's not challenge to China. Trying to maintain the stability. That's Abe's the initiative.
Let me ask you about this question of his. I mean, it is a remarkable shift that we've gone from Japan having kind of higher turnover rates than even like Italy, in terms of their prime ministers, to suddenly being a country where we have now a very long-serving and stable government. The record for longest time in office for any prime minister is who? Was it Nakasone or no?
I think Yoshida, that's a little bit earlier, Yoshida. And Sato, Prime Minister Sato was longer too. And I don't know.
Can Abe match that?
Maybe is really what Abe need is try to change LDP, ruling Liberal Democratic Party rule, because that's limit to the terms.
Okay, so let me ask you about one of the reasons for this great stability of the LDP, the party that everyone wanted to throw out only a few years ago, and then regretted that they had thrown out. Part of the reason that Abe's position is so secure is that the opposition is so weak, and its record was so dismal when it actually had the reins of power. The Democratic Party has a new leader, fascinating character, Ren Ho, sort of a surprise choice. Tell us about her and what her kind of leadership potential is.
Okay, that Ren Ho is a former female actress. Okay. And the very popular figure to the public, and kind of a little bit controversial because she was a half Japanese and half Taiwanese, And the question is, like Ted Cruz asked the Barack Obama, she has a really good, really the Japan's citizenship. She has, but she had a dual citizenship when she was young, and still she didn't give up a passport of a Taiwanese. So a little bit controversial, but no problem for her to be elected. That's probably the Japanese society is changing too, and also, but at the same time, the Renho maintained a good relation not only with Taiwan but mainland China too. And the Democratic Party is, compared to the LDP, relatively the liberal. But at the same time, the Renho is backed by the former Prime Minister Noda over DPJ. And Noda is a realist and somehow conservative. So Renho is doing a very good balance, not so liberal, or not so apologetic to China, but not so anti-China. So that's position. I think it seems to me that, by the way, the Abe's diplomacy is not so bad. Reason is recently you may witness the Abe Xi Jinping meeting, and that was very impressive because Japan didn't concede much for the precondition for the summit, but China somehow agreed too. And China has a domestic trouble because she is struggling for the very difficult things. So the Chinese leader cannot show apologetic attitude to Japan. So, but clearly the Pew Research panel showed that Japan's expectation over the business with China and the economic one is big too. So Mr. Abe, Prime Minister Abe is making a very, very subtle balance too.
So do you see that Renho could rejuvenate the opposition, and is she a potential political threat to Abe, or not really a factor?
Not
see,
now.
Yamazaki-san is sort of shaking his head over here.
No. First of all, not now, because the DPJ's failure, the image is so impressive to all people. People doesn't have a trust over DP.
Yeah.
So may take
Used
a
to be
little bit
DPJ,
more time.
now calling
Yeah,
themselves
may
the
take
DP.
a little bit more. And so far, the LDP is doing better, good. And but I think all good party cannot avoid the downturn of economy and politics, but not soon. I think so. I think year 2020, the Tokyo Olympic year, may be the turning point. I think DP may need to be the opposition party for a while, but potentially they may have a good chance to be the presidential governmental party, but not so soon.
If the economy performs badly in the next 2 or 3 years, does that create an opportunity for her?
Maybe not. The reason is DPJ government didn't show any good performance in
that bad.
And also the trouble is, especially for economic stimulus. I think the last DPJ Prime Minister Noda, who supported Renho, showed a very good the fiscal discipline, but tried to introduce a tax hike, and that was very unpopular among voters. So I think the
finance ministry might disagree with you about the legitimacy. Let me turn to Richard, if I can. The backdrop for many of the political and economic changes that we have been discussing here, the sense of urgency that has infused both of those conversations, is really the continued rise of China. Whereas people might have in Japan sort of been complacent about relatively slow growth and low birth rates and this sort of thing in the past, the sudden emergence of this, potential superpower right across the water from them has suddenly got Japan very nervous, and they realize we've got to get our act together. We've got to figure out a way to start growing. Otherwise, we'll be pushed all over and not be able to have our kind of independence that we're accustomed to. And it's helped, play into Abe's popularity as someone who can stand, as you said, meet with Xi Jinping at a summit, stand up to him. This is a paradoxical relationship, though, in that Japan, on the one hand, doesn't want to fall behind China, and in some ways might like to see China stumble to keep that relative gap as narrow as possible. But on the other, Japan's economy is now very intertwined with that of China. It needs China to be healthy and grow for Japan itself to grow. So we've got this very interdependent relationship. Are you optimistic about the future of this relationship? You spent a lot of time.
No, I'm
looking
not
at
really optimistic about it, but I mean, let's go to the paradox. I mean, you're right. Japan isn't sure whether it wants China to succeed or fail. For Japan, as you said, to become strong, to have a strong economy, in fact, to fund national defense, it really needs a strong China, so it needs a strong Chinese economy so it can defend itself against a strong China, and that's
it's a Cohen,
and
right?
that's kind of not a great position to be in some respects. Now, I think relations are, Abe and Xi Jinping have now met each other 3 times. 2 of those meetings one was at APEC and the other one was at the G20 in Hangzhou,
Right.
and of course, Xi really had to meet him at those places to be a good host.
Right.
So they've stabilized relations, but they certainly have not revived relations in any respect at all. Now we've got the South China Sea playing into it as well. I think the Chinese have been absolutely furious at what they regard as Japan getting involved in the South China Sea issue, which they say is none of Japan's business, rightly or wrongly. And we've got, I think, Japan talking about, although not confirming today, possibly doing joint patrols or exercises in the South China Sea. So that really adds another element of tension on top of what we have already. The history issue, which is both crudely political, deeply emotional.
Yeah.
We've got the territorial issue, which is a permanent kind of issue, and I think China is just turning up it's like the Bunsen burner in science class. They're just turning that up over time to force Japan eventually to negotiate. We've got US-Japan ties strengthening, which of course, has that sense of containment once it's read out of Beijing. We also now, there was a time when, I think one of China's great failings, actually, if you're a Chinese strategist and you want to naturally dominate Asia, why not? You're the biggest country. Then what you should have done was pull Japan away from the US.
Yeah.
And there's been a number of opportunities China's had to try and do that, and they've really failed. And I think now it's too late.
Right.
Because, China is getting bigger. Japan is really flatlining. This is couldn't be a union of equals. And so we're set into a very poor pattern.
Let me ask you about the kind of US-Japan element of this dynamic, because it's a fascinating piece of the puzzle. We heard from Admiral Harris last night, this ringing affirmation of American commitment to the alliance and its partnership with Japan. And yet, you and I have been watching the US-Japan relationship over the course of many years. I can remember where, virtually any Chamber of Commerce speech in Tokyo that you would go to, somebody would get up and pay tribute to Mike Mansfield and utter what was really the shibboleth for everyone, that the US-Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. You had to say that at almost every event. No one says that anymore.
I've been trying to find out when the last time somebody said that was, actually.
It was ages ago, right? So that's an old era that's long gone. And we now have political candidates who raise question marks in the United States about the extent of the US commitment to that relationship. Donald Trump, on the one hand, saying, let's get the Japanese to pay more. And why are we committing, troops and treasure to this country that gets a free ride? Hillary has not been so strident on it, but, has not really gone out of her way to affirm her commitment to the US-Japan alliance. Does that contribute to Japan's sense of insecurity vis-a-vis China, that they suddenly worry more about the US-Japan relationship?
Well, certainly if Trump gets elected, it does.
Trouble.
If you go back actually to 1988, when Trump was thinking of, and you can see this on YouTube, was thinking of running for the presidency then, he said exactly the same then as he does now, and that's the old, paradox about the unequal U.S.-Japan relationship. In other words,
Yeah.
if the U.S. gets attacked, then Japan just sits on its hands. But if Japan gets attacked, then it's World War III, basically. But that's not really the case anymore since Abe pushed through a reinterpretation of the Constitution. Japan can fight alongside the U.S., and that's the big change. But it's changed also in another way because, as you would know from being in Japan for a long time, the U.S. had always come to Tokyo and say, "Come on, Japan, do more."
Right.
And now I think it's turning a little bit. We're getting to the point where Japan's saying, "Come on, America, you do more.
You do more. Yeah.
Stand up to China."
Right.
And that's a very different dynamic, I think. And which is why some people in Washington, worry about being dragged into Japan's fights, and why they watch, Japanese domestic politics and Abe so closely.
Yeah. The pivot implies a rebalancing into a very complicated region, and this is one of the things that China is always saying is about, we don't have alliances. I mean, forget about North Korea, but the U.S. has alliances. Alliances entangle you in complicated regions and conflicts that may not necessarily be in your best interests. The U.S. has decided that, net that's still to our advantage, but it's not clear that the domestic constituency supports that idea in the current age. We've sort of set the scene here. I want to open it up to questions. There are many people here who know a lot about this issue. Let's go to Ambassador in the back. Go ahead. We got a mic back there that we'll start in the back and we'll work towards the way to the front and taking questions.
Thank you. I'm Bilahari from Singapore. We have the dubious distinction of having even a lower total fertility rate than Japan. And we have tried every expedient, and we will continue to try, and you of course must, as Japan must. However, as you yourself said, there's no developed economy or developed country that's been able to reverse this substantially. So the only solution is immigration. Is Japan contemplating a proper immigration policy? And if so, is there a debate on this? If so, what is the state of the debate?
Great question. Yamazaki-san, you want to field that?
Maybe first and maybe forward.
Okay.
So among the new agenda, as I mentioned, that the second round amendments. Yes, to keep the level of the labor force, especially the huge labor shortage in the public works as well as shipbuilding. We have already decided to accept some foreign labor forces. But this is not how it's called a change of the immigration policy, because we will not allow their children or grandchildren stay in Japan. So maybe partially, with some conditions, with some specific time, we can ready to accept some foreign forces, but not change of immigration. So it's very difficult for Japanese to seriously thinking about the fundamental change of the immigration policy.
But you mentioned the problem of an aging society, right? I mean, one would think that creates a perfect justification and rationale for accepting caregivers, Philippines, other surrounding countries that have very extensive infrastructure of overseas workers and are accustomed to providing these kinds of services in greater numbers. I mean, I remember going to the Aichi Expo and being a guest of Toyota and them showing us these amazing robots that played the Saints Go Marching In and all this stuff. And I said, guys, this is amazing, these robots and what they can do, but what are they for? And they said, well, first I asked them how much they cost, and it was about $250,000 per robot. And I said, what are they for? And they said, we think these have lots of applications for the aging society. We think that they can help provide care for Japanese elderly. And can I say, I live in Hong Kong. You can get a Filipino helper for about $1,200 a month. You don't have to pay $250,000 for a fancy robot that can play the trumpet to take care of your old people. Why doesn't that seem like an obvious solution to Japan?
Yeah, actually, just for the nurse or the babysitters or such some people with some expertise, we are now allowed to accept, but not as immigrants. I mean that
Not as permanent.
Yeah, not permanent.
Right.
Not
But Singapore,
it ends
Singapore,
up like
Hong
that.
Kong, all
I
these
mean,
other cities have systems that
Yeah.
allow for them to come temporarily
Yeah.
and go back and forth.
But
right?
also,
Not-
if you have guest workers, if
Yeah.
it's a guest, but that look in Germany, the guest workers became a permanent population.
Right.
It just happens like that.
Yeah.
They grow up speaking Japanese. The kids.
Yeah.
Why would they leave?
Well, but maybe they add to the economy. Why should they? Why would you want
Why
them
should
to?
they? Yeah.
The guest work is the solution, I think, it's very realistic. The reason is, of course, no country now, anywhere in the world, they're very, very reluctant to have
It's
permanent
reluctant.
immigrants.
True
And
enough.
Japan didn't have such a tradition. But if you visit Japan, you may see a lot of guest workers anywhere, especially
Yes.
from Asian neighbors. So I think that is a de facto. By the way, the U.S. too. I think the Trump says the war to the Mexican border, but the many informal worker. Without it, impossible to run the current economic
Absolutely.
growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone else had a question here in front. Can we bring the mic up? Can you tell us your name and your...
I'm president of the Ultimate Trade,
Uh-huh.
I do international trade consulting.
Okay.
And,
Is there a microphone for you?
my question to you is, Japan is going through an anemic sort of growth and very much eager to be part of the TPP. And how it's going to affect in terms of revitalizing the economy of Japan. So could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And do you think TPP is going to happen? Is Japan still expecting that?
That's the one thing is that I wanted to ask the question is the immigration is not the only solution. I think free trade is the really good one, but not in short term, long term. And the TPP is one of the reasons. I think officially Japanese government don't say, but potentially I think the Abenomics third arrow that requires some kind of structural change. And the international agreement is potentially to force the domestic change of a structural reform. I think that's one thing. But of course, TPP is not so easy. Not Abe's the diet session, coming diet session. One of the major issue is a ratification of a TPP. I think Abe may do that because Abe would like to take a big pressure to the United States. And the issue is the U.S. So especially the lame-duck session or next administration, that's tough question. But the Japan continue to have this kind of things. Not only TPP, but other form of the free trade agreement.
Richard, can I ask you, do you think if they ratify TPP, is that going to have any pressure on the United States at all? Will Hillary or Donald feel compelled?
I don't know. I
Japan-
mean, I do live a few blocks from Congress, but I don't know whether I should be sort of in a room full of Americans trying to tell them what's going to happen.
be objective, because-
Well, to be objective, you'd have to be very pessimistic about TPP getting through Congress in the lame duck session.
Yeah.
The big impact of Trump has been to make trade a dirty word in the Republican Party.
Right.
It was always Republicans in the House, particularly under Paul Ryan, who supported TPP. 28 Democrats voted for fast track, I think, and they need to probably double the number of Democrats in the House to get it through. And it's, I think it's tough. And we're seeing all the usual sweeteners come in the lead up to it. Lots of trade actions against big bad China and that sort of thing to try and so the administration can make it look like it's
Build some
doing
credibility.
stuff. But after this election campaign and with Mrs. Clinton's about turn, she clearly fears it. Then it's very difficult. Never say never.
Yes, we have a question back here.
Thank you so much. I'm Jacek Bodoshinsky from Pomona College here in Los Angeles. I have a question about Abe's efforts to normalize the Japanese military in the context of U.S.-Japan relations. I find it somewhat puzzling or counterintuitive that during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, an invasion that was considered by the world to be illegitimate, didn't have a UN mandate and so on, that Koizumi was able to deploy Japanese troops at a time when there wasn't even talk of normalizing the Japanese military like there is now. But now in the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq, Japan has been unwilling, despite the fact that some Japanese citizens have died at the hands of the Islamic State. How would the panelists explain this contrast?
Watanabe-san, you want to tackle that?
I think, first of all, normalizing Japanese military is not good word because still the Japan the military situation is very abnormal. I think because that U.S.-Japan agreement is clearly U.S. is an offensive role, taking an offensive role. Japan is concentrating on the defensive role. This will not change. So I think, probably a little bit closer to the normalizing to the, as for the defense of Japan and the security surrounding Japan, I think that is the case. So, for example, the Iraq case, I think at that time Japan dispatched self-defense forces only for the humanitarian aid. And that continues. But a little bit different one is probably UN-sponsored peacekeeping operation. Japan could do a little bit more. Before, Japan self-defense forces cannot defend the other countries' troops joining a PKO. But now Japan could defend other countries. So it's a little bit going to the normal. All countries can do that. So that's because of Japan's past in the World War II, the Japan's aggression to the neighbors. And it takes a very long time to normalize. And also, that's possible because Japan had the good alliance with the United States. But Japan is gradually changing this.
I think you need to also, don't start in 2003, start in the first Gulf War, where Japan did very little, very late, paid $13 billion, got no thanks for it because of the way it handled it. And in 2003, it's also distinguished by Koizumi, who wanted a close relationship with Bush, who acted quickly and largely symbolically as well. So I think it's about the leadership as well.
Yeah. We haven't talked about Article 9. Is there any more popular support for that under Abe? Is that gaining ground, or is that still stymied? He has a problem in that he depends for his majority on the alliance with the Komeito, which is, got maybe a few people that support that, but not everybody. Is there a constituency to make that happen, or is that still not something that will fly in the Japanese political system?
I need to explain the Komeito. Komeito is a party who has the coalition with LDP, Abe's LDP. Komeito has been backed by the Buddhist organization, the very pacifist nature. So even I think for amendment of the constitution, Japan really needed the 2/3 majority of both houses, right. And the national referendum required a majority, and it's a very high hurdle. And I don't think Abe could be easily change Article 9. First of all, coalition partner Komeito doesn't like it. Yeah. And also, I think Abe would like to spend more his own political capital to economic revival. That people really wanted to. So I'm not so positive for the Abe could change Article 9. And by the way, without it, Japan could do many, just after change of the interpretation of Article 9 and with security legislation passed last year.
Yeah, it's not about to happen, I think. I think people, getting ahead of themselves.
Yeah, back in.
Ask question.
Okay, great.
Kevin Hanley with Merrill Lynch. We began on finance, so maybe we can end on finance.
Sure.
Given the demographic realities, which even immigration probably can't touch,
right,
and the massive debt in Japan, the mathematics seem to indicate negative interest rates as a quasi-permanent condition in Japan. Do you agree with that assessment?
Negative interest rates, are they here with us for the long term because of the weak demographics?
Weak demographics.
Yeah.
Are they permanent?
Negative interest rate in Japan is, I talked with, say, ECB or European other central bank guys who introduced first. And in Japan's case, that's just 0.1. And also that the target is very much limited, not the whole of the excess reserves, but just the incremental part. So which means that's a very modest one. And but nevertheless, it's really shifted down the whole yield curve. And of course, eventually it helped Japanese reducing Japanese fiscal cost. But it is, I'm not thinking that this situation lasts permanently. Of course, that's when actually Japanese inflation rate or close to 2%, sometimes Japan BOJ will start to change the monetary policies. So if your question is about how it's called, its impact on the fiscal situation, I think it is not so, I'm not so much optimistic about it.
Yamazaki-san, can I ask the obvious follow-up to that, which is that we all expect that sooner or later the Fed is going to start raising interest rates here. That's going to have a very significant consequences for the decisions that Japan has to weigh in terms of setting its own monetary policy. What do you think will happen when the Fed starts to tighten again?
But every central bank are first taking care of their own economies, and of course taking into consideration the global economic circumstances. And even for Japan, that the U.S. very sustainable growth is our merit. So that's why I don't think that even the different direction causes any serious problems among developed central banks.
A good balanced answer from the finance ministry. I don't know whether that's a sell or a buy on Japan, but how are we on time? Do we have time for one more, or can we take one more? Okay, one last question, right here. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have a last quick question.
Sorry,
it's okay.
Looked like we had a couple of minutes still.
Thank you all. Great discussion. Lupcho Fidanovsky. My question revolves around the cultural impact in Japan and how these future generations coming up may change the way things are done in Japan. And I see that with my own children. It's becoming a smaller and smaller world, and they've got friends all over the world through, because of traveling, because of food, because of everything else that's involved in their lives. And we just actually did a tour in Asia, went to Japan and Singapore and Hong Kong, and they felt, pretty comfortable everywhere they went, and they felt the whole, they felt a camaraderie with all the other kids, and they share a lot of the same technologies, they share a lot of the same things that they like, and I'm wondering if that's going to change Japan. And we kind of middle-aged guys here talk about how Japan is changing, but I feel like the next generation may have a little bit of a different perspective on their cultures and their societies. And we talked about immigration, and in Japan, women in the workforce has also been something that I think Prime Minister Abe has tried to tackle. But I'm curious if you see any trends in the millennials and younger generations that might drive some changes that are not foreseen to guys like us.
That's a great question. I'll let you two kind of weigh in on it, but I want to just kind of offer one little bit of perspective on that, which is that as I travel around the region, Japan is a bit of the outlier in the sense that Japanese kids are less adventurous, less willing to travel overseas than other kids from the region. And Japanese parents really discourage their kids from going to school in the US. I mean, if you look at the statistics, 300,000, something like that, Chinese students, they keep the American higher education system afloat. Japanese numbers have gone way down in terms of overseas students in the United States. William Saito, who's this guy who was an entrepreneur, he teaches at Keio University, told me this great story the other day about how he was so committed to getting Japanese students to go overseas and broaden their horizons that he set up a scholarship for 5 of his best students. He said, I'll pay you full ride to go to any university in the US that you can get into. Just go and study in the United States. And he said he was stunned at what happened next. The students were kind of ambivalent about it. And then within a week, he had at least 3 of the parents of the students in his office saying, you're ruining my son's life. How can you do this? You're going to send him out. He'll get exposed to foreign culture. He might marry a non-Japanese girl. He won't be able to get a job in a Japanese company because they'll think that he's weird, he's different, he's not really Japanese. How could you do this? He thought he was doing a huge favor to these kids, and the parents saw it exactly the opposite. Boy, if you go to talk to Korean parents, they're willing to move to New York to have their kids, in junior high school prepare for the college entrance exams. China sending them in droves. It's true everywhere around the region. Japan is the exception to that. Do you see Japanese kids becoming these kind of multicultural kids?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But the trend, I think when I was I was at 20s, the Japanese student anywhere in the United States too.
Yeah.
So I think a kind of a trend. But at the same time, the new generation is more grown up or born in outside of Japan. And that's clearly the internationalized. But that's clearly polarized. Some people are very domestic oriented. Some are very much accustomed to the overseas, like my son, born in the US and grown up. So I think a very different two types of people. But I think a new generation have a more self-confidence on the individual rather than the group. I think that I'm not so pessimistic.
Yeah. All right, on that note of optimism, I think we are obliged to conclude. Please join me in thanking our outstanding panel, and thank you for your questions.